We'll begin our next session now. In the Eye of the Sun, Ahdaf Soueif in conversation with Salil Tripathi.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, evening. It gives me great pleasure to be here at the festival with Ahdaf Soueif. For those who have, who follow the Booker Prize announcements each year, they would of course know her fantastic work, The Map of Love, which came out in 1999 and which was shortlisted that year for the Booker Prize. But there's much more to Ahdaf. She is a writer, an activist, a truly committed to the Palestinian cause as well as what's happening to the world in the conquest and the conflict between the West and the Orient, as it were. These are some of the issues we will be getting into. She was born in Cairo. Her first collection of stories was called Aisha, which came out in 1983, which also was on the shortlist of the Guardian First Fiction Prize. After that, there was another collection of stories called Sandpiper in 1996. In 1992 was the large novel, 800-plus page novel called In the Eye of the Sun, and then, of course, The Map of Love in 1999. After that, there is a turn in her career, which we will also talk about, and she wrote a considerable amount of serious non-fiction, including the collection called Mezzatera, and then, of course, in 2012, Cairo, My City and My Revolution. She chairs the Palestinian Festival of Literature, and besides, she's also won the Mohammad Darwish Award as well as the Kawafi Award. So a good straightforward point to start would be that what made you write? What brought you to writing?
Thank you, Salil, and it's a tremendous pleasure to be with you on stage. In the first place, you mean? Well, I really don't know. What I do know is that one day, having finished my PhD and waiting in England for the viva, therefore not having a job because I had to go back to Cairo to take up my academic job, I found myself one afternoon with nothing and no commitments, and for the first time really in my grown-up life without an MA or a PhD or something looking over my shoulder. And I thought, well, if you actually think you want to be a writer, then why aren't you writing now? And I kind of went over to my typewriter and started writing my first story. So this means that somewhere in my head was the idea of wanting to be a writer. And I'm told by friends and parents that I had sort of expressed that wish when I was very small, but I don't remember that.
And then, of course, you have made London as well as Cairo your home. So can you talk about that divide? How do you divide the time between the two?
Well, I don't anymore. Since the Egyptian Revolution, my home is completely in Cairo, and I go to London maybe 3 or 4 times a year. I have a son who's still living there, and I have various kind of work commitments there. But in any case, it all happened by accident. It was never intentional. I went to England to do the PhD because I was teaching in the English department at Cairo University, and the regulations then were that, I mean, obviously, if you're academic staff, you have to get a PhD, and if you're in the English department, you had to go to either the UK or America. So I went to the UK and I finished the PhD, and just before I went back home, I met Ian Hamilton, whom I later married. And so basically, falling in love with and marrying, I mean, rest his soul. I mean, he was not English, he was Scottish, but anyway, it meant that my children were there. It meant that life was then split for a very long time, so that we were always in England during the academic year and in Egypt in the holidays, and so on. And then that changed with the revolution.
So this Anglo-Egyptian encounter, both at a personal level as well as at a political level, has been part of your life. And more interestingly also in your fiction, when we look at Map of Love, you're talking about Lady Anna Winterbourne, who is with remarkable sensibility. She looks at what she sees, what Edward Said today would have called it Orientalism, the way the British tend to look at the regions that they conquered and they ruled. And you talk about her relationship with Sharif al-Barudi, and then, of course, the same story, it's a similar story also precedes In the Eye of the Sun. Now, the question I have is about the language here. One is Arabic, one is English, because one of the things that you have said at one point is that you dream in Arabic, but you have not been able to write in it. And the reason I'm asking is that apparently, again, something I was reading about you, that your mother who translated Map of Love into Arabic, you and she often would have arguments about the use of words, and you almost said, whose novel is it anyway? So can you talk about that relationship of the two countries, the two languages, and the empire and the colonized?
How long do we have? I hope you've got your pajamas with you. Yeah, well, okay. When I started to write, I surprised myself by writing in English. Again, that was not, it was not deliberate, it wasn't a plan. And when I worked it out later, I worked out that because I had first read in English, because I'd been in England with my mother, who was doing a PhD when I was 4 years old, and I continued reading in English, and because I studied English literature, basically I ended up with Arabic as my lived-in language and English as my literary language. So that was kind of the first interplay or standoff between the two languages. I could read Arabic perfectly, and I could write Arabic well enough to write a report or even a piece of criticism, but I couldn't access it to the degree that you need if you're going to actually create art, create fiction, create effects in your reader through language. So if I was writing in Arabic, it was as if you have a piano and you could only access 2 octaves rather than the entire keyboard, whereas in English I could access the keyboard. So that was the first thing that I had to realize and live with. The Map of Love, I suppose, was born out of this business of living in England a lot of the time and in Egypt part of the time, and being married to within English culture, and so the Map of Love deals with issues of language, of when is language, and I'm sure this will have resonance with a lot of people here in India. You know, when is language actually a means of communication, and when is it actually a power play, or a means actually of disguising meaning? It's also about whether a real relationship is possible across cultures and what it takes. And it's also about the relationship of Egypt to the West, whether it's England in the beginning of the 20th century or the United States at the end of the 20th century. So the novel explores these issues. I don't think really that In the Eye of the Sun does that, but the Map of Love certainly does. And the last thing to say, I guess, on this issue of language is that being in Egypt during the revolution, I was invited to write a column in the most progressive daily, Arabic language Egyptian daily, Shuru, which is also owned by Shuru, who's my publishing house in Arabic. And I resisted that for a while because I was convinced that I couldn't do it, that I couldn't actually write a column in Arabic. And eventually I did because I was shamed into it. And it was very difficult. I have felt it becoming a more natural process. I've been doing it for 4 years, 3.5 years. And it's been really interesting to see, to kind of watch how I work in Arabic as compared to how I work in English, even though I still believe I can't write fiction in Arabic. And there are still nuances, subtleties, ideas that become too difficult for me to put into standard Arabic, which is what you have to write in. And so actually I find myself just skipping that particular idea because I just don't know how to do it. And I still look at passages that other people have written with tremendous admiration. And what's interesting and rather fun is that the readers who actually like me will say things like, you have a very distinctive style and we love your style, but actually it's not a style. It's the maximum of what I can do. It's not that I have sort of 15 different choices, it's that I only ever have one choice. And that choice is a little bit ragged because it reflects my limitations. And that has now become my style that people kind of like and respond to. So finally about my mom, yeah, I was tremendously honored. My mother is sort of the reason for whatever it is that I guess that I've done in my life, starting from the fact of being bilingual because she was doing a PhD in England when I was from 4 to 7, and the fact that, that English stayed with me because her library at home, as I was an older child and then a teenager, her library of fiction, drama, poetry was so much more interesting than my father's of sociology and politics and psychology. So I carried on reading in English, and then she decided to translate. She was professor of English language and literature, and she has an amazing translation into Arabic of King Lear, which is actually in repertory and has been for the last 10 years in Cairo. And so it was a huge privilege that she translated The Map of Love, but as is usual with children and parents, even the consciousness of what a privilege it was didn't stop me annoying her and questioning her and objecting to her choices. And eventually she said, well, okay, when I have different options for a particular sentence, I will put all the options, and you could choose which one you want. And then it actually became a very rich and collaborative effort with sort of evenings around the dinner table where the whole family would be working out what would be the happiest rendition in English of a particular phrase. And yeah, it was good.
So this whole English and Arab could be seen as codes of West and Islam. And the reason I'm saying that is I wanted to turn to the other essay of yours, The Language of Veil, where you looked at veil through a different view, and you even talked about the empowering part of the niqab as from the context of political Islam. Can you tell us a little more about that? The context in which it was said.
Right. Well, I don't hold with the Western Islam thing, and I don't hold with identifying Arab as Muslim, because in fact the real richness of our societies in the central part of the Arab world, in Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Tunis, was their diversity, was the fact that, I mean, in Egypt you can still feel, even though it isn't identified as such, you can feel the culture of the ancient Egyptians, you can certainly feel the Jewish culture, and you can most definitely feel the Christian, the Coptic culture. You have 15 million Christians in Egypt. And so Islam, yes, of course, Islam became the dominant culture, and in its golden phase was actually enabling of the other, of the cultural manifestations of the other religions, but it's a very Western construct to equate the Arab world with Islam, precisely because it conceals this diversity and ultimately makes it possible to see all conflicts in absolutist religious terms rather than in practical, geopolitical, economic terms, which of course is much more helpful and useful.
Indeed, and I mean, I would strongly recommend those who haven't read to read the essays in Mezzatera, because this is how you describe and define Mezzatera as a region: Muslim, Christian, Egyptian, Arab, African, Mediterranean, non-aligned, socialist with small-scale capitalism. This is how you describe it, and that sounds like a great place to be in, yeah.
It certainly was, yeah. They're working
breaking
very
down
hard
borders and interchangeability of cultures, yeah. So tell us more about that time, because you've written very vividly about it.
Well, I think you've really kind of described it there. This was basically the time that I was growing up, which was the 60s, and this was a time of openness to the cultures of the world. I mean, Egypt had been open to the cultures of the world well before that, but this is the time when I experienced it. I mean, my sister-in-law tells a story of her mother, who is Muslim, and whose best friend, Tante Elena, was Jewish, and Tante Elena used to fast Ramadan with my sister-in-law's mother. So she used to say, you know, I just had a little yogurt this morning, and then I'm fasting with you. Mm-hmm. And that was, I mean, so there was a lot of sort of interchange and anecdotes like that. I guess I caught the tail end because a lot of it was destroyed in 48 with, or a process of destruction was started in 48 with the creation of the State of Israel. And then another wave, of course, in 56 with the attack,
Suez,
Britain,
yes.
France, Britain, exactly, with Suez. And then actually another wave in 62, which was not a political so much as an economic wave, because this was the time of the great nationalizations and the sort of putting in of a socialist program, and a lot of people who were able to, who had other passports or who had family elsewhere and really did not want to live in a socialist structure, decided to leave. So I caught the tail end of that, but it was still very much there, and it was still as an idea, it was very current and very backed by the system. So yeah, so basically the government, I guess you would say at that point, the whole policy of the state was to encourage people to think of themselves as world citizens with a special location, which was all the things that you described. And so, I don't know, I mean, it sounds very frivolous, but the fact that there was a big Indian festival every year, the fact that all the tennis players on their way to Wimbledon would stop and there was the March tournament in Cairo, the fact that many of the top theater groups had Cairo in their repertoire as an annual thing, and that you could go and watch Khachaturian in the dress rehearsal for the Cairo Symphony Orchestra for £1. You know, it was a time of great cultural diversity.
So what created the essentialization and the dehumanization that followed from that? Was it the 67 war, are we talking about?
Well, I have to do this briefly because otherwise, I mean, basically, the fact that Egypt was not a democracy in the 50s and the 60s after the 1952 revolution or the free officers' coup, depending on your political alignment, that really hit us with the defeat of 1967. I mean, that was the punishment for actually being a dictatorship, even though, of course, the thing was that it was a dictatorship that was ultimately on the side of the people, ultimately on the side of the poor and the disenfranchised, and that everything until now, if you go to a village in Upper Egypt, a school, a canal, a health center, they will tell you this is from the Nasser days. And so it was beneficial in that sense, and a generation of us grew up believing in it and loving it, and it's very hard to divest yourself of that. But the fact that actually it was a dictatorship, a military dictatorship, led to the defeat in 1967. So the country reeled from that, obviously, and there were huge demands for trials of officers and so on. But then it started to pull itself together. It started to rebuild. It was making ground in the attrition war that was then launched. And then Nasser died in 1970. And with the death of Nasser, in came President Anwar Sadat. And President Anwar Sadat really didn't like the system that he had become president of. He didn't like socialism. He didn't like non-alignment. And he billed himself as the Ra'is al-Mu'min, the believing president. His project was to dismantle Nasser's project, basically, and to become a friend of the Americans. And it sounds a bit facile, but he actually invented military medals that he then wore on his chest.
Gave himself those medals.
Yeah, because when you say, he invented medals that had not been existing before. It wasn't he gave himself existing medals. He designed and invented medals. And it's because when one says that essentially...
I did it as a schoolboy, but...
He wanted to be a friend of Henry Kissinger and Marcos and to sort of live a particular kind of life. And he believed in capitalism. But in order to beat down the pan-Arab, socialist, pro-Palestinian, pro-the-poor project that Egypt had been in for 20 years, he had to find something else. And his something else was the Islamists. And that basically is what happened. So in order to beat back the left and the secularists and the socialists and so on, he nurtured and brought in the Islamists. Now, of course, they had always been there, and they had always been in some kind of either relationship or confrontation with the government, but they were in a weak position. They often had to be underground. They were a current, like other currents, and he brought them forward. He actually, or his system, engineered the rigging of the elections of student unions and professional unions in order to allow the Islamists to take them over. And in the process, he also opened up the country to foreign investment, which was not a good thing because it all came in things like service industries and so on. He dismantled the industrial infrastructure of the country. And you had huge inflation. And so at the same time, you had a big exodus of people heading for the Gulf countries, the oil countries, particularly Saudi Arabia at the time, in order to make a living, huge chunks of the middle class. Coming back a decade later with the ideas and the money from there. So coming back with Wahhabism and with money, while Sadat had been promoting this and pushing them into positions of power. And ultimately, of course, they killed him because they took themselves seriously, as he did not take them seriously. But that was really the beginning. And that is, we're seeing all the extensions of that now. Of course, strengthened and exacerbated by the confrontation with the West, which they and the West insist on seeing in religious terms.
Yes. Now to jump a bit forward to 2000 and your visits to Gaza and the essays you wrote for The Guardian, what took you there? What prompted you to turn your gaze towards Gaza, as it were? And why was that conflict picked over, let's say, just for argument's sake? I mean, you're talking about, say, the crisis in Tibet or any of the other national self-determination. What was so special about it?
Well, I guess as a child of the Nasser generation, we were brought up on Palestine. We were brought up on the Palestinian cause and its centrality to the Arab world, and indeed to the idea of justice in the world. So it was always part of my makeup and part of my concern. And both in The Eye of the Sun and The Map of Love have Palestinian strands running through them. In 2000, there was the second Intifada, and The Map of Love was published in 1999, and it was nominated for the Booker, which meant that I had then visibility and had a certain. I was in a different position from before the nomination. So when the Intifada happened, and The Guardian called and said, would you like to go to Palestine? Would you like to go and write about the Intifada? I said yes immediately, even though I was terrified. And I went. and it wasn't to Gaza at that point. It was to Jerusalem and Ramallah and Nablus and I think Jerusalem, Ramallah, I can't remember. But I went for a week and I wrote a diary and I went back to The Guardian and they had commissioned 3,000 words and I went back with 10,000 and argued until they actually published them in full and published them very powerfully. And this was not a decision, but what happened from then on was that I found that I had a platform, which was a rare thing. I mean, I'm sure that you know that it was very hard to actually present a story from a Palestinian point of view, a news story from a Palestinian point of view in the Western media. And I found that suddenly this space had opened up for me because of the fiction. This space had opened up for me to do that, and I felt a responsibility. So so basically that's what.
But staying with the thought that in a sense, since then you have not written major work of fiction.
No,
is it that the reality that you saw was so harrowing that the best way to describe and stay engaged with it was only through non-fiction? Or is it that, I mean, that it was in a way weird enough and dangerous enough and unfair enough to engage you so much that fiction wasn't necessary? What thought? Did you ever feel like writing a novel about it, for example?
My thought was that it would be presumptuous to write a novel about Palestine because I hadn't lived it enough. Because to go in for a week and come out and write a novel was just the kind of thing that people do to Egypt all the time, and I really don't like them for it. So I wasn't going to do it for Palestine, but I needed to continue to be engaged. And I think that what happened, so my choice re-Palestine and because once you've written about Palestine a few times and then there's a protest in Egypt, say, then people ask you to write about that. And so you're basically in that area of cultural activism. And what it seems like is that it always seems like the event at hand which you're being asked to write about or which you have a wish to write about needs to be done now, while fiction can wait. Or that fiction is such a long project that to start a novel, you're looking at 2-3 years. So it was always, yes, I will start a novel, but I'll do this thing first. And this thing then also branches out into being asked to go and speak to people, being asked to do advocacy things, talk to a committee in Parliament, and soon really your time and your brain space is taken up, and you find that a year has passed and 2 years and 3 years, and you haven't actually started that fictional project. Now, if I can jump even further forward to say that actually what is happening to me now is almost the opposite. I said that I'd been writing a column in Egypt once a week for 3.5 years. And of course, with everything, this sort of roller coaster that we've been on in Egypt, it needs to always be really topical and really with its finger on the pulse, like it's the right tone, it's the thing that people want to hear about this time, from me anyway, and so on. And it's in Arabic, which means that I'm slightly sort of like working with one hand tied behind my back. And as things have got worse and worse and worse, I've realized that actually what I should do, and this isn't from like the point of view of me as an artist almost, it's that the duty now is to try to engage with what is happening on a broader canvas, to allow myself to try to do what I can do without being tied down to the immediate, the topical, the talking about who was arrested this year, or what travesty, this week, or what terrible contract was signed this week, or whatever. That to just allow myself to step back and see things in a more whole, or in a larger, through a larger lens, and try to engage with that. And maybe that is really the contribution that me and people like me, and this is okay because I know Egypt. It's not like I'm going to a different place and writing about it. This is my country, this is what I know through and through, and have lived through all the things that have happened. And I think that it now is not enough anymore to deal with it on this very piecemeal basis, I think.
And in a way, I mean, to stay with Egypt, I was going to ask you about fiction, but we can come back to that. But to stay with Cairo, you stepped out of the room. I mean, you stepped out of your laptop. I mean, stepped out of the room in which on the desk was a laptop, and joined in when the Tahrir Square was. Just tell us what it was like, the revolution. Well, and there's a book, of course, about it. Yeah. So.
Yeah. Well, actually, I was here in India when it happened. I was in Jaipur, and it was a day when I had finished my events, and it was a day when I had nothing, the 25th of January. And so I kind of just went for a walk. I went to look at the city, and I came back in what do you call them here? We call them tuk-tuks. The little taxis, the three-wheel...
Rickshaws, auto rickshaws.
Oh, the auto rickshaws. So I came back to the...
Tuk-tuks in Bangkok, yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah, same
Egypt,
thing, but yeah.
In Egypt, it's tuk-tuk. In Cuba, it's Coco Taxi, I think.
Okay.
Anyway, so the auto rickshaw, so I came back in one loaded with quilts that I had bought in the market. And I found messages saying, what's happening, what's happening, what's happening. And I went and switched on television and got CNN, and they were in Tahrir. CNN was in Tahrir and talking about sort of crowds of people and so on. So I called my sister, and she said, yes, something's happening. So I got a car next day and went to Delhi to my very good friend's home there, and next day went to Egypt, which was the 27th, and from there really we were in the streets. So yeah. So
were you afraid?
Sorry?
Were you afraid?
Was I afraid? No, actually, because when you're on the streets with thousands and thousands of other people, and there is that tremendous energy, you somehow you're just part of the whole. You're part of that body. It almost, I don't know if one can say it doesn't matter what happens to you, but you feel invincible. So no, I wasn't afraid then. There were moments later, of course, when I was, but during those early times, no, not at all, no.
And I mean, elsewhere you talked about this whole battle with fiction in a way. This is what you wrote. Fiction will come again, I hope, and maybe you'll tell the stories of the Bulaq Sands, where the police killed Amre al-Bani, or of Samira Ibrahim, who put a stop to the military virginity tests, or of Ahmad, who had one eye shot on January 28 and another in December, or Khalid Said's mother, who adopted a young revolutionary, who lost her son and therefore adopted other young revolutionaries as her own. So there are obviously lots of stories that can be woven in. Is that a project you are currently embarked on? Or is this the kind of next step that you might take, writing something along these?
Yeah, well, it's kind of a bit jinxy to talk about a project that you haven't yet started.
Fair enough.
But I'm hoping to do something with fiction, or to start allowing myself to think in terms of fiction very soon. And I've actually stopped. I mean, I've arranged with the newspaper that carries my column that instead of carrying a column for the next few months, they will carry installments of my translation of the Cairo book. So there is still, because the space is now so closing down around us that it's wrong, I think, to let go of a space that still exists for a particular kind of voice, and so you want to hold on to that space, and also this is a very practical point that we have 16,000 young people in prison at the moment. And a lot of them are from the revolution. I mean, there are, of course, a lot of Muslim Brotherhood and Islamists, but there are a lot of people from the revolution, and there are a lot of people who were kind of, you know, just arrested to make up the numbers. And in prison, you don't have the internet, so you don't have social media. All you have is you have either state television and you have the newspapers, the paper newspapers. So the only way that these young people can feel that, you know, through the press that people are still thinking of them is through the limited spaces that are now available to us. So we agreed that, that these two functions, holding onto the space and still having a voice there for the kids in jail, would be served by installments of the Revolution book. And that would allow me to step away for a bit and see if I can do something else.
Tell us about your nephew, Allah, who I have met, of course, in San Francisco. He's an activist on internet and human rights, and he has been in and out of jail, Allah Abdel Fattah. Is he still inside? Is he able to blog or tweet or anything like that?
No, he is in jail now for the 4th or 5th time since the revolution. And
so is his wife, you were telling me.
No, not his wife, his younger sister.
Younger sister, I'm sorry.
His younger sister, yeah. Actually, we could, I mean, if those things could come up now, that would be quite nice. Yeah. So this is actually, if I may, yes, with his hands raised. I just pulled these images together this morning and brought them in, and they very kindly putting them up. With his arms up, that's my nephew, Ali Abdel Fattah, who's a big blogger and activist, and next to him is another of the detainees, I think that's Doma. And this is the Shura Council trial, which they are now on trial for. Could we have another image? Because I just want to show you. Okay, well, that's him with his baby and with my father. Okay, so this is Ali with Khalid, who was born while he was in jail and who is now 3, and that's my dad. And this is the glass cage that this government has created. This is a courtroom that has been set up inside the police academy, inside Tora jail, outside Cairo, which is now serving as a courtroom. They've set up this court as part of the war on terror. It's supposed to be a court to deal with terrorism cases, which means that the judges appointed to adjudicate in this court are handpicked by the head of the appeals court. They don't sort of just rotate in the normal way of court districts. And they constructed within that courtroom, and normally in Egypt, the dock is iron mesh. Here you see the, yeah, thank you, yes, exactly. Here you see the iron mesh, but you also see the double tinted glass cages constructed around the iron mesh. What this means is that the defendants, who we should all remember are innocent until proved guilty, that the defendants who are held inside these glass cages, they're obscured from the view of the people outside, and also that whether they can hear what's happening in the court or whether the court can hear them is controlled, obviously, by switches that are with the keepers of the room. So they can decide whether people hear them or not, and also the climate. And the climate in these things tends to be extremely cold, and of course a lot of the defendants are sometimes on hunger strike, or they're allowed heavy clothes or not, and so that in itself is pretty brutal. This is a scene from last Thursday, where we were at this court. This particular picture was taken by my son. We were at the latest hearing for Ali and his friends, and the court was adjourned, and it was the birthday of one of the young men, Taimur. So everybody got up onto the benches. You can see the police at the edge there, where they don't allow you to go on the further benches to get closer to the prisoners. So they make this line, and you're on the other side, and all the young people climbed up onto the chairs and onto the benches, and they had brought a big cake with them. And we all sang happy birthday to you, to the prisoners in the glass cages. And here, this is brilliant. This is the prosecutor's bench. This is the bench of the public prosecutor during the court. The guy with the red sash and his, his very attentive, alert demeanor there is the representative of the prosecutor's office, and sitting next to him on a chair at the prosecutor's bench is a police officer. So this is really just really nicely representative of the brilliant relationship that is now happening between the police and the prosecution and the judiciary. This is the outside of this makeshift courtroom. This is what you have to go through to get to it, and this is a further gate inside. So you're constantly under the supervision, and it is by the grace of the military and the police that you are allowed to attend a court hearing, where, of course, it is an essential condition of court hearings that they be public. So that's really, yeah, I wanted to show you that. So anyway, as far as Alaa is concerned, we were talking about free expression.
Yes.
Now Alaa essentially is, he's a software man. His actual profession is that he works on developing open source software and on Arabizing content, and he runs workshops on empowering citizenship through social media. His big thing, really, since he was about 15, is that people should be allowed to say what they want. And this is perceived as being so very threatening to every regime that has taken power that he's now been in and out of jail for, well, the first time was in 2006 when he sided with the judiciary as a very young activist against Mubarak, and so he was locked up for 56 days as just a tweaking his ear kind of thing. When the revolution happened, he and his wife and partner, she's also a software engineer, were in South Africa. They had decided to take jobs that were offered to them in South Africa, doing open source and trainings. And they were in South Africa, and they had just taken a big house, and they'd invited everybody to come and visit, and so on. And the revolution happened. So on the 2nd of February, they arrived in Tahrir, and they stayed, and then they went back to South Africa, resigned, gave up the rent of their house, had a fire sale of their furniture, and came back to Egypt to support the revolution, and decided that the world was now a place that was so full of hope that they could start a family. So they started a family, and by the time Khalid was born, Alaa was in jail. So he's now, the first jailing was under the security, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces in November 2011, and there had been a massacre, which was called the Maspero massacre. 5,000 Egyptian Christians had marched into the center of town to demand certain reparations for churches that had been burned down, and the army actually started shooting at them, and when Alaa heard of this, he and other activists went down from their homes and went to the scene, and he was then accused of stealing and destroying an armored personnel carrier, of stealing army weaponry that was in that carrier, and of killing fellow protesters with it. Eventually, a civilian judge threw the case out and, in fact, ordered the trial of the witnesses. But that was number one. Now he is, again, the charge is that he called for a protest when the protest law was in force and made protesting illegal. And they've added a charge in order to make it a criminal offense rather than a misdemeanor, that he attacked and stole the walkie-talkie of the police commander who was in charge of dispersing that protest. In the last 2 hearings, his lawyers have provided total and utter proof that this was nonsense, because they've managed to get hold of the phone the phone record
Yeah.
of both him and the officer, and the phone records prove that there was like half a mile between them at the time when the officer says that he was beaten up. And also, they have, again, with great difficulty, gotten hold of the written transcripts of the charges and have proved that the charge of beating the police officer was added later in a different hand. So the case is a nonsense, but in a first round of it, he and the 23 people who are being charged with him and who are really going to be jailed because the government wants him were given 15 years. So in this round, we're expecting that they will probably be given 5 years, and the media will carry headlines saying Alaa's sentence reduced to 5 years by, you know, the clemency of the government. So it's a very nasty situation, and what it boils down to is that in the last 3 years, we have seen the judiciary move from a position where you could be fairly confident that if you went to court, you would get a fair hearing, to a position where you're certain that you won't. So at the time of the Maspero trial, because the Maspero trial was going to be heard in a military court, my sister went on hunger strike, demanding that the trial be moved to a civilian court. And eventually it was, and the civilian judge threw it out. Now there's no point in demanding a civilian judge, because those of you who follow the news will see the, you know, sort of sentencing 500 people to execution. It isn't going to happen, but the fact that that sentence can actually be uttered is something. And we've just seen, I mean, the judge in this case, for example, just keeps saying, hurry up, we want to finish. I mean, he just, and these, at one moment, a previous judge on the case, who has been the regime's man for 15 years and has been implicated in rigging elections and so on, he, at one point, decided that maybe he'd had enough of being insulted on social media, maybe his kids got onto him, we don't know. But he suddenly recused himself from the case and ordered the release pending trial of Alaa and his colleagues. That judge was moved to the family court the following week. And the judge that we have now, when they turned up for their next session, simply jailed them again, even though they were out on bail. So anyway, that's...
Fascinating story, yeah. And revolution, this is how revolutions get stolen. We have about 5 minutes, so I'm sure there are many questions. If you keep them short, we can get more of them in. The gentleman there with the glasses with the hand up, and there's a gentleman at the back with the striped t-shirt after that. Oh, yeah, why don't you start? The person in the white shirt, yeah, please.
Okay, this has to do with the educational system. It appears that you and I both went to school in the 1960s. Now, as I recall, Egypt probably had a pretty open-minded education system at that time. In certain countries, the education system has been severely compromised thereafter. For example, in Pakistan, which also was quite good in the 1960s, it's been severely compromised. Has the educational system been compromised severely in Egypt? Because public opinion in the long term depends very largely on the educational system and the integrity of the education system.
Thank you very much. It hasn't been compromised in the way that the Pakistani system has been compromised, if you like. This could have happened, you know, like if I mean, when the Brotherhood came to power, they and the Salafis, the committees that they wanted in parliament were the ones to do with education. But what has happened is that the education system has been horribly run down. So you have a lot of kids coming out of state schools not knowing how to read and write. So no, there isn't sort of pernicious content within the system, but the system is not working.
Hello? Yeah.
Yes, madam, you had said earlier how it was pretty pleasant actually living under a dictatorship of Anwar Sadat. And you know, Western media you know, has called leaders like Bashar al-Assad as secular dictators even. And right now, especially the Eastern Orthodox Christians in the Arab world is under a lot of duress. if the patriarch of the Syrian Orthodox Church is actually in exile in Lebanon. So if Morsi could have brought a strict Sharia law-based system, so at some level, was it justified that he was overthrown to avert a Syria-like crisis?
Thank you. One thing to really, really know about the Muslim Brotherhood is that they do not have an Islamist ideology. Morsi was never going to institute Sharia law. The 1 year that the Muslim Brotherhood stayed in power, everything that they did was towards taking ownership of the Mubarak apparatus, both the economic apparatus and the political and security apparatus. They were not trying to push an Islamist agenda. They were pushing sectarian speech. They were pushing division. They were not punishing the burning down of churches, but they were not going to change the structure to an Islamist one. The issue of his removal is, of course, very tendentious. It is completely true that the country rejected him, and with good cause, but it is also true that the military used that rejection to take over the government in a way that has also been very bad for the country.
Yeah.
Hello?
Yeah, quickly, please, because I've been told to wrap up, so
sure.
please. But you've
In
been
the
waiting.
beginning of your talk, you spoke about the clash or the interaction between your Egyptian identity and your English identity. I'd like you to shed a little bit more light on the interaction between your identity as an Egyptian and your identity as an Arab, especially in light of the Egyptian revolution being a part of the greater Arab Spring, and whether there was an easy transition or interaction between these two, or was there ever some sort of rift between the two?
Okay, I'm going to have to be very brief. So I will just say that I don't speak of it. I don't have an Egyptian identity and an English identity. I have an Egyptian identity, which a bit of it is sort of, contains an Englishness in culture and in literature. Now, in terms of Egyptian and Arab, there is no clash between them at all. I mean, I think being Egyptian is part of being Arab, and being Arab now is part of being Egyptian. And one of the things that was very, very heartening at the beginning of the revolution was the fact that the young people, like my nephew, were immediately talking about setting up, for example, a techies office in every liberated Arab city. So they already had one in Tunis, they were looking at Libya, they were looking at Cairo, and so on. They were talking about pan-Arab projects, and certainly the pan-Arab dream was being revived with Palestine at its center. So the last thing I'll say is that in Tahrir, on the 11th of February, when Mubarak stepped down, and when we ultimately, very ill-advisedly, left the streets, the first song, the first anthem that went up to celebrate the deposal was an anthem about Egypt, Bil Ahdan ya Bladna, I embrace you, my country. The second anthem was Watani Habibi, which is Beloved Nation, which is all about the Arab world and lists every Arab country with an apex, of course, at Palestine and Jerusalem. It's all part of the same thing.
Thank you very much indeed. I'll end with one quote from Ahdaf. Is a novelist an activist? And she said, how can you disengage? If you have the gift of narrative, how can you absent yourself from the great narrative of our time? And she has been part of it. Thank you very much.